Ruski Mir, Russian world, as a soft power weapon that is used by the Kremlin and its proxies in Russia itself, in the Russian Federation, and more broadly beyond it. Anywhere where the Russian language is spoken, the Russian world and the concept of the Russian world seemingly gives license to the Kremlin to take active political interest and even military interest in this idea of intervening to save or to protect Russian speakers. The idea of protecting Russian speakers for anyone who spent even 24 hours in Ukraine is just absurd. If you were to ask my father, is he English? Because he speaks the English language as an Irishman. He'll have you thrown out the window in no time. Russians invade other countries and Ukrainians don't, as the key difference between the two. Notion that there's some sort of brotherhood or eternal connection between Ukrainians and Russians is a historical myth. It is a soft power weapon. The important thing for us in the West to understand is that Russia is still an expansionist land empire, and Ukraine and Crimea are its most treasured colonial possession, most important colony. Russia is a massive country, the largest on earth, and it does not need more territory. It certainly does not need to destabilize and destroy the European project and the project of liberal democracy, but it's chosen to. They focus on studying those markers of the so-called Russian world, the ones that look familiar to us, they look beautiful, they look intriguing, and fail to see these other markers of savagery and destruction and expansion.
Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko and you're watching my podcast, and today I'm in Cambridge and I meet Rory Finnin, the professor of Ukrainian studies at Cambridge University. His primary research interest is the interplay of culture and identity in Ukraine. Also, he focuses on the history of colonialism in Crimea. Hello, Rory.
Hello, Jenny.
How are you today?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks for coming to Cambridge.
Oh, thank you for inviting us and having us here. So, who's Crimea, Rory?
This question, who's Crimea, Chey Krim, is an important one because it implies that Crimea should be possessed or that someone owns it, can acquire it. And this very concept is problematic. So if one thinks about, first of all, Crimea as a political entity, it's clearly part of Ukraine. It's Ukraine's sovereign legal territory. If one thinks about Crimea as a historical object, then the inheritance of the Crimean Tatars is paramount for us to understand. So this is a Sunni Muslim, Turkic-speaking national minority of Ukraine, an indigenous people of Ukraine who for centuries had political sovereignty over Crimea and really have been the stewards of Crimea for a very, very long time. And unfortunately, this question of who's Crimea often pushes the Crimean Tatars to the side when in many respects they are a very central actor. So who's Crimea? Clearly Ukraine's under international law. But if one is looking more deeply at historical and cultural questions about Crimea as a home, the Crimean Tatars are a very key actor that we need to keep in mind.
You wrote in your book, Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimea Atrocity. I'll show our viewers. It's an amazing book. I told you before we started filming, and now I didn't expect the academic book can be so engaging, so touching. I read it preparing to our interview, but I'll definitely go back to it. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's a major compliment coming from you. Thank you.
Did you the Crimea belongs to Tatars, so ethnically, culturally, by all means. Did you feel it before or when you started to work on your book?
I felt it before. I first went to Crimea in 1995. And at the time, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I was a teacher in a village in central Ukraine. And Peace Corps trains us in... Peace Corps is an American volunteer organization that was started by John Kennedy in the 1960s.
I had a teacher from Peace Corps.
Really?
Yeah, Laura Vanderberg. Yeah, she was my teacher when I was in year 10 and 11. She became my friend for life. Yeah.
Well, I don't know Laura, but she sounds like an extraordinary person. Well, I was a teacher in central Ukraine, and I learned Ukrainian for 3 months. So they train you in the Ukrainian language. And when I went to Crimea for the first time, I was speaking in Ukrainian, probably something like Surzhyk, which is a kind of patois of Ukrainian and Russian, more Ukrainian than Russian, but nonetheless, probably with some Russian words thrown in. And traveling through eastern Ukraine, there were rarely any issues at all using the Ukrainian language from this, skinny American kid. In Crimea, interestingly, when I used Ukrainian, I received some, furrowed eyebrows, some strange looks from some people. But with Crimean Tatars, they were keen to speak to me in Ukrainian. And it was really through them and through friendships I made there that I learned how ignorant I was about one of the most decisive moments in 20th century history in Ukraine and in Central Europe, and that is the deportation of the Crimean Tatars in May of 1944. So we're marking 80 years since then this May. And so really talking to them about their displacement, their exile, made me aware of what had taken place. What I didn't know until I started my graduate work was how many different kinds of writers and cultural figures in Turkey, Soviet Russia, and Soviet Ukraine reacted to this event. And they saw meaning in it in different ways. And so I wanted to try to interpret that meaning in this work. And that's where the book originally got started. It also got started because some dear friends in central Ukraine in my village gave me a book of poetry by Mykola Rudenko. And I remember, having been in Ukraine for probably a year trying to decipher this one particular poem, and it was called Tatarin. And it was about a Crimean Tatar who was being beaten in Donetsk, where Rudenko grew up. And I just couldn't understand this poem. It was a poem with two conflicting ideas. One was this warmth and love for Rudenko's Donetsk neighbors, and then also this shock that they were beating a Crimean Tatar. And it's a very provocative poem, very contemplative poem. And I remember sitting in my room trying to understand what it meant. And so these things really influenced, I think, later my development as a graduate student and wanting to understand this event a bit more and then try to see it from another angle that was more culturally focused than politically focused.
What is it, Russian world? In Ukraine, there's kind of narrative. The consequences of Russian world, especially now when we talk about war crimes, about the atrocities which Russian occupation brings and during the war. But how would you explain to the people in the West what does it mean, Russian world?
We have to understand Ruski Mir, Russian world, as a soft power weapon that is used by the Kremlin and its proxies in Russia itself, in the Russian Federation, and more broadly beyond it. It has different meanings depending on the audience. The most important thing for us to understand is that it is a monolithic, highly restrictive and violent ideology that has underscored and influenced aggression in Europe, that is destabilizing this continent, that's threatening our security. It often operates on this notion of the Russian language. So anywhere where the Russian language is spoken, the Russian world and the concept of the Russian world seemingly gives license to the Kremlin to take active political interest and even military interest in this idea of intervening to save or to protect Russian speakers, even though these Russian speakers are never really threatened or vulnerable at all. So it's a really pernicious ideology, one that has led to the worst war in Europe since 1945.
Protection the Russian speakers, it's something I can see through the threads on the social media where people who spoke Ukrainian from very early age, long before Orange Revolution of Dignity and this full-scale invasion, they took the actually Ukrainian language needed protection. And I'm coming from Ukrainian-speaking family, but I studied in Russian school. So for me, both languages, they were equal. But when I started being trained for journalism and everything, obviously Ukrainian became my tool and then it's my position and everything. Did you notice living in Ukraine, did Russian speakers need protection or Russian language, or you noticed something else?
The idea of protecting Russian speakers for anyone who spent even 24 hours in Ukraine is just absurd. In the 1990s, I lived in Ukraine for over 2 years. And I heard, when I began to learn a bit more about the place of the Russian language in Ukraine, because of course when you come as a foreigner to any country and you're just learning the language and you haven't studied it before, every word is new, and every word that you hear from your friends, your students, your neighbors, they're not marked as necessarily Ukrainian or Russian when you hear them. So you just absorb this language and you try to use it to the best of your ability. But the language that I studied when I first arrived in Lutsk with all the fellow Peace Corps volunteers was certainly not the language that I heard very often spoken throughout Ukraine. Russian had a very prominent place in all areas of public life, on television. All the films were dubbed, usually with one man's voice, into Russian. All these Hollywood films were in Russian. So many books on sale in kiosks and train stations, near bus stations, were largely in the Russian language. The idea that Russian needs protection in Ukraine is really an absurd idea, because it's had the primary position in the linguistic landscape of Ukraine. But the spiritual position of the Ukrainian language has always been very important. And what I think we have failed to understand in the West is that Ukraine is a multilingual country, one in which you may move from Ukrainian to Russian and back again many times over the course of a day. So in mostly monolingual England or monolingual America, it's hard for us to imagine, if we're not, let's say, an immigrant coming to this country, moving between languages on an hourly basis, where you might see a Ukrainian language advert, speak to your colleague in Russian, move into your place of business and use Ukrainian, then go home and speak Russian or Crimean Tatar or Hungarian with your family. That's a very easy movement that most Ukrainians have made between languages that we find hard to understand. And to a degree, the Kremlin has operationalized our ignorance about the linguistic environment of Ukraine against us. We have sometimes, even in the media, spoken of Russian speakers or Ukrainian speakers without understanding that they can be both, right? That a Ukrainian speaker can be a Russian speaker and a Russian speaker can be a Ukrainian speaker, that these languages are all there. And I think it's high time, 2 years after the full-scale invasion, for us to understand that these terms just don't make sense. And thinking in terms of language politics has been a really reductive way to understand Ukraine, and we need to part with it for good.
We all in Ukraine speak at least two languages, because people closer to Poland, they speak Polish, to Hungary, Hungarian, Romanian, and you name it. But does speaking Russian language make people ethnically Russian?
I also find this question comical and absurd, because my family comes from Ireland. We lost our command of the Irish language. We use English, but if you were to ask my father, is he English? Because he speaks the English language as an Irishman, he'll have you thrown out the window in no time. That's just a completely nonsensical idea. There are many Russian speakers. In fact, prior to the onset of the full-scale invasion, according to former President Petro Poroshenko, the most military personnel killed in the war in eastern Ukraine, fighting off Russian aggression, were so-called Russian-speaking Ukrainians, who were, of course, close to this aggression, saw the threat of this aggression, and were fighting and still fight to this day. So this notion of being a Russian speaker making any kind of political difference for us as scholars or as observers of Ukraine is simply not a helpful way of understanding the country. There are many Ukrainians who have found a great love and embrace of the Ukrainian language, like Taras Shevchenko, the most pivotal 19th century, and perhaps even for Ukraine across their modern history, the most pivotal and influential cultural figure, who clearly lived in this really unique and special way with Ukrainian, but also wrote his diary in Russian and didn't think about language use as some sort of black and white zero-sum game. And so that's changing all the time because of the trauma of Russia's war of aggression and the way they have weaponized this notion of a Russian-speaking Ukrainian against Ukraine. And I think many have transitioned to using Ukrainian more often than they would have with than otherwise. And that's clearly, this is a clearly dynamic and changing environment, but we need to put away for good these simplistic understandings of language politics in Ukraine. It's not a helpful way of understanding the country at all.
Isn't it typical where there's empire and former colony and this linguistic twists? Is it, because take any country in the world which was occupied by France or any, the local people would speak the language because the country was occupied, obviously. And linguistics is one of those markers, being occupied or being liberated, isn't it?
Absolutely. And multilingualism is a very common position for the colonized subject. You have the language you speak with your neighbors, your family, and then there's usually an occupying power, a language of administration that you have to learn if you were to navigate those corridors of power too. If you look at even the early 19th century, there are many Ukrainians who participated in some respects in building up the Russian Empire, who would be in St. Petersburg and use Russian. And then in their local circles of Ukrainians within the imperial capital would use Ukrainian. They'd go home to their town, thinking of people like, Mykola Hohol or Nikolai Gogol, who would come back to Mirhorod and hear more Ukrainian and use more Ukrainian. So that's absolutely the case. Multilingualism is a very common phenomenon among colonized peoples. And for us to only see just a sliver of that linguistic use and to flatten that vibrancy, it's, particularly from an academic perspective, a real problem. And it's persisted in the study of Ukraine and the region for far too long.
Is there a difference between Russians and Ukrainians? And what kind of difference would you explain to the people in the West world?
Well, I've been asked this question before. In fact, I was asked this question in Kyiv, and I gave a long-winded academic answer. And then I noticed in one of the comments, the first and most liked comment was, Russians invade other countries and Ukrainians don't, as the key difference between the two. I think that's a really concise way of understanding the difference, but there are many, many different ways to understand Ukrainians vis-a-vis Russians or Poles or Crimean Tatars or Hungarians. And it's important for us in studying Ukraine to not always tie Ukraine and Ukrainians to Russian and Russians. This notion that there's some sort of brotherhood or eternal connection between Ukrainians and Russians is a historical myth. It is a soft power weapon. Ukrainians, like any normal European country, have relationships with so many different peoples and neighbors. If we're talking about colonialism in Ukraine, and I hope we can chat about that a bit more, we have to talk about, of course, Russian colonialism in Ukraine, but we also have to take on board Polish colonialism of what they call the Kresy, the eastern borderlands. And this persistent, let's say, cultural colonialism in which Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian language have been put in the subsidiary or tertiary position, made to feel less than, made to feel subservient. This is a kind of cognitive colonialism that we're now only beginning to confront in its full. So the differences are one of imperial center, an imperial ruler, and colony. The important thing for us in the West to understand is that Russia is still an expansionist land empire, and Ukraine and Crimea are its most treasured colonial possession, most important colony. Lots of reasons for that. But it's important for us to just remember how it's really until the 17th century that Ukrainians are operating and living, or the people we now call Ukrainians, are operating and living in a completely different cultural and political context from Russians and Muscovites. When there is a real connection between the two groups in 1654 with the signing of the so-called Treaty of Pereyaslav, the Ukrainian Cossacks led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky and Tsar Alexei's representatives, they needed translators to work with each other. They didn't know much about each other. Ukrainians were raised and they grew up, many of them who were educated elites, for instance, they were trained in a completely different kind of intellectual tradition. That after the colonial absorption of the Ukrainian lands into the Russian Empire, that made them so useful for the Tsar, because Ukrainians could be translators. They could be civilizational translators for the Muscovite Tsars, and that led to this growth of the Russian Empire, which is why Ukraine is so important to the Russian imperial imagination. It was with the absorption of Ukraine in the 17th century, and then fully absorbing Ukraine in the 18th century, that Russian imperial power reached a zenith. And so without Ukraine, Russia and its imperial dream falters. And we have to understand Russia as an empire. And as so many excellent historians have been pointing out, from Timothy Snyder to Serhiy Plokhy and so many others, Olena Styazhkina, for instance, says this so well. This is an empire that needs to be destroyed and needs to fall. And in falling, I think we'll see a brighter future for Europe, a more secure future for the world.
So you think there's no chance for the empire to carry on?
I think over the long term, it's bound to fall. I think over the long term, it's bound to fall. It's just a question of when and at what cost. And as we see, the cost is massive and heartbreaking and enraging, really. But I think it's inevitable. Russia is a massive country, the largest on earth, and it does not need more territory. It certainly does not need to destabilize and destroy the European project and the project of liberal democracy, but it's chosen to, and it says it wants to, and we need to be very aware of exactly what they are trying to do. But I do believe that ideas ultimately prevail, and the ideal of freedom, the kind of ideal of volya in the Ukrainian context, a defiant freedom against external aggressors, that is a concept and an idea that I think has potential to indeed liberate not only Ukraine, but hopefully those peoples of the Russian Federation in the future. But I think that's a question of what's on the horizon to come. And right now we need to be focused on, of course, supporting Ukraine with everything we have before this escalates further and consumes all of us for generations.
The attempts of Kremlin's reimperialization attempts and how much prospects, but we just discussed it. And there's a thought that all empires lost when they were in the war with their colonies. Would you agree on that?
Absolutely. I mean, we see it time and again with European empires, and Timothy Snyder has made the point very persuasively that defeat of empire was good for France, it was good for Britain, and over the long term, although I think it's premature to talk about what might be good for Russia, but I do think it would be a constructive, productive thing for the Russian people. But we need to be very aware of what you just mentioned, this reimperialization, this recolonization. So right now, the Russian Federation is recolonizing the lands it colonized before. It is doing so through violence and genocide. And that's a fact that I think we here in the West avoid too often. Obviously, it's a highly political term, genocide. And it's used a great deal to describe almost every single geopolitical conflict, and perhaps overused. When it comes to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and I do believe it's really important to be clear with our terms, to not speak about Ukraine war, Ukraine conflict. This is Russia's war against Ukraine. This avoidance of Russia in discussions of what's taking place in Ukraine today is a major intellectual and journalistic problem, I think academic problem too. It's a kind of cowardly avoidance, if I'm being honest. And this aggression is leading people to be deported, children separated from their parents, slaughtered, killed, murdered. It's taking place before our eyes. And it's the same project that took place decades and centuries before. So our failure to acknowledge Ukraine's colonial history, how both from the Polish side and the Russian side, Ukraine has been an object of colonial desire and expansion, has led us to not see and to avoid now recognizing a new kind of recolonization in occupied Ukraine. And it's following the same formula as it did in Crimea, as it did in the areas of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. It's high time for us to take on board that history, to study it closely, and then to see just how horrible this repeat of this history is.
What are the markers of the Russian world? The Russian language, Russian ballet, Pushkin, Tolstoy, are they different in the West and in the post-Soviet countries?
I think the historian, writer, and civic activist Olena Styashkina, originally from Donetsk, puts it very well. That, and I'm paraphrasing her here or kind of adapting some of her ideas, but she's very clear that the Russian world and the markers of the Russian world, on one level, are barbarism and savagery and expansion and destruction. And that savagery and destruction have been internalized, I would say, in Russian society. I mean, we have a majority view that's very comfortable with this imperial expansion, that sees it as Russia's mission in the world, sees it as a civilizational question. That's the kind of marker of the Russian world we should begin with. And then there are the markers that the Russian world and the Kremlin likes to present to the West. And this is indeed ballet, poetry, and literature. This is an attempt to show Western Europeans that, look, we're like you, and we have high culture as well. But this is certainly true, and all cultures have amazing movements and works that we should all celebrate and learn, no matter where they are. And Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, etc., Belarus are no different. But unfortunately, what we've seen is the West has been focusing at times, particularly, let's say, in the academic space, institutionally. They focus on studying those markers of the so-called Russian world, the ones that look familiar to us, they look beautiful, they look intriguing, and fail to see these other markers of savagery and destruction and expansion that have marked Russian history for a very long time, such that, for instance, if we think about 2014, Russia hosted the Winter Olympics in Sochi. And I remember at this time, not many journalists, academics questioned, first of all, why Winter Olympics were being held in Sochi in a fairly warm climate, but also Sochi was the capital of Circassia, a place that Western audiences and readers knew very well as a Muslim polity whose capital was Shacha, or Sochi, and the Russians conquered Circassia. They killed and murdered the Circassian people, caused a mass population displacement across the Black Sea to Ottoman Turkey in the 19th century, and wiped out their history, wiped out emblems of their culture, such that today, or at least back in 2014, European journalists could visit Sochi and not even notice this other culture that had been destroyed under their feet. This has been going on with Russian history for a very long time. It's taking place in Mariupol. And I have a nightmare, frankly, that 50, 60 years from now, academics will be referring to Mariupol in the same way they did with Sochi. And it's time for us to really realize the stakes of that thought and to do whatever we can to fight against it. This integration and connection between the peninsula and the Ukrainian mainland is really key for us to understand, because so many seem to think that we can just make a deal with the Russian Federation, hand over Crimea as if the issue will go away. When Russians keep saying Krim nash, Crimea is ours, it speaks to this insecurity and this knowledge, frankly, that Crimea is not theirs.
Ukraine is blamed for cooperation with Hitler.
From an academic perspective, it ticks every box.
How about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, especially Unit Azov is blamed for that?
This notion of, a Ukraine for Ukrainians. For a lot of Western politicians and analysts, if they could sacrifice Ukraine to achieve that stability, they would.